You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I am privileged today to have a very special guest on this show. He's Dr. John Hyland. He is got quite an illustrious track record. I'll let him describe some of that and tell that story. But without further ado, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
So on that point, give us the Cliff Notes version of your career journey. You've got some very significant milestones along the way.
Sure. So I'm on my fourth career right now. I started life as a soldier, as an Army officer. I came out of college in the middle of the Reagan era, the big defense buildup in the United States, and off I went to the freedom. And I was quite literally patrolling the Iron Curtain the month it came down in November 1989. I was right on the border between East and West Germany when that happened. And then I was in the middle of Desert Storm in 1990-91. And so I got to have a very interesting short military career. I then went into policy, high policy. I ended up that part of my career as an assistant secretary of state, working for Condoleezza Rice when she was a secretary of state. And that's where I really started studying strategy. I got to do several advanced degrees. I studied with some of the most famous British strategists of our time. And it really got my head thinking about, bigger issues, not just what's right in front of me, what do I need to get done by Friday, but how does this stuff all fit together and move things forward? I launched a business career. I've been the CEO of 3 different companies and the COO of another, both public and private. I've done an IPO. I've gone private to public, public to private. I've probably done maybe 20 M&A transactions in the course of leading those companies. And all 3 of the ones I built are now in the hands of large public companies. They were bought and merged with large public companies. And now I'm an academic. And I teach at several colleges, both in a business school and at the undergraduate level and in some other master's programs. I'm teaching a combination of leadership and strategy things, which led me on to, this most recent book that I wrote.
Well, I told John that when we were lining this show up, I was excited that his wheelhouse of late is strategy and strategic thinking. And to my listeners, I'll say many of you know that we've done work together on your career advancement. And inevitably in the career journey, you come from doer to leader. And there is also a pivot from task and transaction delivery to strategic thinking. And the first big question, it may sound overly obvious, but the big question is, what is strategy? I don't know how to do that. And so John, talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe it's part of what you're teaching to students now, but how do we move from that task-oriented mindset to bigger picture strategy thinking?
Yeah, Doug, you put your finger on it. It is probably the single most important transition an executive can make, and it happens to everybody, no matter what your field is, no matter what your specialty is, and here's why. We all come into the workforce, as you pointed out, being rewarded for our technical and tactical skills, our ability to get stuff done, which is great. As soon as you're put in charge of something or somebody, or maybe a bunch of things or a bunch of somebodies, your success goes from your technical and tactical skills to your strategic and interpersonal skills. That's on the things on which you need to rely for success once you're in charge of something or somebody. Strategic skills. Where is this organization going? How are we going to get there? What does there even mean? How do we know it when we arrive? Who's doing what along the way? How does it all stack together? Right? These are the common elements of strategy. A complete game plan and blueprint to move an organization to a point of greater advantage to confront the future. Interpersonal skills, motivating people to be good followers, work together, accomplish things as a team. So those are the skills that you rise. Even the chief technology officer of a big technology company doesn't write a line of code, doesn't do any network and systems design. They oversee a whole series of strategic and interpersonal things, hundreds of technology projects, a huge set of things. So everybody knows they need this skill to progress in their career, but the vast majority of corporate training is oriented on more technical and tactical certifications and skills. So it's an odd dichotomy. And I think you put your finger on one of the problems is we can't identify what it is. I tell a story in the book of a director who was, asking somebody, coaching an executive, are they ready for the boardroom? And the coach said, absolutely. She's terrific. She's got all these executive competencies. She thinks conceptually. She knows how to get things done. She can motivate people. And the director said, well, I'm not sure she thinks strategically. And the coach said, what does that mean to you? And the director couldn't articulate what it meant to think strategically. So we're actually holding people accountable for something we sometimes can't articulate ourselves. And so it's a funny phenomenon, but everybody needs to get their heads around strategy, recognize when they're strategically thinking or when they're just trying to get stuff done, and then learn how to exercise that muscle. How do you exercise your strategic thinking model as part of your executive development?
And on that note, I think one of the things that happens, it's to your point about there's no real accountability because not everybody can describe it or define it, even though they may be in the senior roles. I think one of the symptomatic aspects of it is the aspiring leader who is climbing the ladder and confronted by one of the seniors that have already gotten there. There's this kind of friction and frustration, but it's usually unspoken. It's sometimes implied. Maybe it's just a facial tone or reaction when the junior says to the senior XYZ. The senior kind of shakes his head. That's not what I'm looking for. But the senior's not saying it's not technically correct. It's just not strategic.
Right.
And I'm frustrated. I'm not getting what I need. And now the junior's frustrated because he doesn't know what to deliver. And you got this season of tension in those levels. And I don't see a lot of leaders that are good at identifying that and trying to correct it in a healthy way.
Yeah, no, it's important, and you see that same tension come out in the dialogues I have in the book, because that's the way people get to these things. They go back and forth. They have a conversation. They have a dialogue about this. That's why the book's called The Strategy Dialogues, and you'll see that tension emerge. One of the reasons the tension emerges is because strategy is an unnatural act for most executives, and I cite a study in the book that shows that when they tested hundreds of executives and they looked at what was their natural action logic, the way they rationalize their decisions, the way they explain their actions, the way they try to persuade people to do things. Only 4% of executives naturally use a strategic action logic to win the day, to get the meeting to go their way, to defend their turf. And by that, I mean, they explain their rationale as a series of moves that'll build to a different future. So I say, Doug, here's why we want to get this done by the end of the month. Because if we have this information at the end of the month, then we can shape the next quarter. And if we shape the next quarter, we might be able to do this competitively next year. If we do that competitively next year, we're positioned in the market totally differently in 3 years. So now I've outlined a series of chess moves, basically. Whereas most executives, they say, Doug, you know why we need this at the end of the month? Because it's due at the end of the month. Like, what don't you understand about this? Or, that's the data we need to make our numbers for the quarter. 2/3 of executives in this study, their action logic is that of a short-term achiever or of an expert. I need the data or I need to get something done. So strategic action logic is not natural. The good news of this story is everybody's got it inside them. It is quite literally a different part of your brain you use when you use to think strategically. It's more of a right brain, creative, future-oriented, art of the possible part of your brain, as opposed to your analytical, break problems down to their lowest level, solve problems today part of your brain, process data part of your brain. So right brain for strategy, left brain for crunching data and solving today's problems. So everybody has the capacity. You just need to know where the muscle is, what it feels like when it's turned on and alive and working, and then actually practice and exercise it like any other muscle you might be interested in building.
So, John, in your work, where does the relationship of vision, which is a popular attribute of good leadership, cast the vision, give us the big picture, where does that overlap in the giant Venn diagram of leadership with this idea of strategic thinking?
Yeah. Well, it's important, but a vision's not a strategy. A goal's not a strategy. A single move's not a strategy. They're all part of a strategy. A mission's not a strategy. Values are not a strategy, but they all inform a strategy. A strategy is a complete package, a series of interconnected moves to take an organization from its current place to a better place, a place of further competitive advantage. What does that mean? What does place mean? How do I even understand what you're talking about here in terms of place? So this basket of things that go, and I have a whole chapter on there on how vision, mission, and values relate to an actual strategy. They need to be pulled apart and put back together again. Vision is important because strategy happens in a more situation-dependent and ambiguous environment because it's about the future, and the future's not yet happened, which is why we call it the future. Most executives are more comfortable in an environment in which they have the data and they know how things are going to turn out. They're looking for perfect data. Strategy's ambiguous. There's no right answer. There's no formula you can plug numbers in and get to it. It's big picture, not small issues. It's long range, not short term right in front of you. And it seeks to see patterns in the universe and connect them and see how they affect you. What's happening with your suppliers? What's happening with your customers? What's happening with technology? What's happening with government regulatory environment? Anything that might touch or connect your business. What's happening with your competitors? Where are they moving in the market? So the ability, and I break this down and give very, very step-by-step frameworks for people to work through as they do this, including some fun exercises that I've seen work with my clients and my students. The ability to break that down and say, how does my vision, an aspiration of what the world looks like when I'm touching it, the part of the world I touch, what I want it to look like, how does that manifest itself in real activity and the kind of place in the market I want to be in? So there's a lot of detail that goes after the vision, but everything has to flow from a vision. The one other thing I'll say on this is I tell people that strategy is not a brilliant idea or vision generation game. Because sometimes I'll work with a team, they're like, oh, I've got a brilliant idea. And I'm like, why don't you park that for about 2 days? And after we go through a strategic thinking process, a disciplined way to think, using some frameworks to help us gain insight about our external environment, our internal capabilities, the way other people are working within it, what's the art of the possible. Maybe we'll get to an idea that looks like yours, but let's not start with the brilliant idea, the brilliant vision. That's not the point. The point is to have an organized way to look at potential moves in the future, weigh courses of action, and only then, make a decision and put a strategy behind that decision. So I think, vision's important, but it's only a piece of this larger thought process. At the end of the day, strategy is a way to think. It's not a what to think. And I think if people focus on a what to think, they start and end with the vision. And I think the process is actually more important than the outcome.
Now, to me, the the flip side of all that is I'm thinking of many, many situations. I've either been a guilty victim or partner to, and that is the giant leadership retreat where we're going to go map out our strategy for the next year, 2 years, whatever. And there's this 2-day, 3-day offsite
Mm.
event that happens, and there's meetings, and some big binder gets created, and
Mhm.
it goes on somebody's bookshelf. I'm looking at your bookshelf
Yeah,
behind
yeah, yeah,
or mine,
yeah, yeah,
and nobody ever talks about it again.
yeah,
It's just,
yeah.
but they check the box. We had our retreat, we got our work done. So, but then they go back, typically in those that are guilty of doing this, typically they go back to that quarterly performance metric.
Yeah.
How are we going to make our numbers for this next quarter?
Yeah. No, this is something. So I facilitate these kind of retreats, and so I've been on a lot of them. I'm the like this I call the strategy guy. Bring him in for our offsite, right? So it's always funny to me because one of the themes of the book is that strategy needs to be a part of your everyday hygiene as an organization, not something you do occasionally. This is, in the Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, in a lot of European communities, they thought they should only bathe on very rare occasions because they might get sick from bathing, right? And so people think of strategy that way. I say, well, when was the last time you guys looked at your strategy? Oh, we do that every October at an offsite. I'm like, why October? Because they're like, oh, we got to do our budgets and everything. I'm like, oh, so it's your annual budget drill. It's not really your strategic thinking. And they're like, oh, what's the difference? Strategic planning, as practiced by most corporations, I call it corporate programming, is not necessarily strategic thinking. In fact, they can be the opposite. Because as you pointed out, strategic planning is often demands a lot of data. And if you have data, it's about the past because you can't have data about the future. Maybe you have some linear projections about the future. By the way, the future never acts in a linear way. There's always discontinuities, right? But the quest for data, the looking at next year's plan from a baseline of last year's results always drags your mind backwards. And it almost always results in a so-called strategic plan that is a modest improvement over last year's baseline. Strategic thinking casts your mind forward and says, what would have to be true for this to happen? Like, how do I unshackle myself a little bit from last year's data? Because what's different about the future and how can I operate in it? So these are two very different ways to think. And if you restrict yourself to only saying, I'll only practice this big thinking strategic stuff at the annual offsite, then you're letting the calendar control when you refresh the direction the organization is moving. So people say, well, when should I readdress my strategy? I say anytime something significant has changed in your environment that affects the trajectory of your organization. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. You can have a huddle. You can have a quick huddle at the end of a meeting and say, holy cow, did you see that tariffs are being imposed tomorrow? Well, that'll affect our supply chain, won't it? Yes, probably in the short term, boss. Yes, it will. Okay. Our supply chain and our cost basis and our business model base are an important pillar of our strategy. Do we need to refresh our strategy as a result of, well, we may need to. Well, let's run that data. Let's run that analysis, right? So I tell people, work it into your everyday hygiene. End every meeting with a strategy moment. Okay, we've decided at this meeting, we're going to rush out the new release within 2 weeks. Before we leave this room, to all go to work like crazy to get that new release out, let's go around the room and say how this decision contributes to or doesn't contribute to what we've all agreed are the strategic objectives of the organization over the next 2 years. Now, that little discussion at the end of the meeting may change nothing, but it'll put everybody in a mindset that at the end of the day, we're harnessing our activities to a strategic journey. And we need to exercise that part of our brain, not just the get stuff done part of our brain.
Yeah. You've helped me with a thought that I've used in my coaching, and I now believe I'm making a quick decision. I'm call it strategic thinking on my part. I need to modify something I've been telling people. I have encouraged leaders that in order to be able to respond, not react to things around you, you have to be able to lock into your vision. I've used that as my frame of reference. Do you know what you're wanting to do, where you think your team, your domain is going? And that needs to be the lens that you view all moments. And when you get this curveball news of something that just bubbled up, either through a supplier, customer, market, regulation, whatever, can you filter that quickly through the lens of what you've got? So my point is, what I'm now hearing and I'm totally embracing is the idea, no, it's not just that vision piece, it's the strategy that you've agreed you're going to be using to get where you agree you need to go. And now that this unknown has bubbled up and new surprise, new data, new information, how does that impact the course that has been plotted?
Completely. And the reaction can be everything from, I just need, as they say in the sailing business, I just need a little tap on the rudder and sail in a slightly different direction because of this new development. Or, my gosh, we need to reassess our entire strategy. We agreed 2 years ago we want to move from this neighborhood to that neighborhood. And we agreed on what that journey looks like. We've sequenced the activities. We've ironed out the dependencies. We know how to keep score along the way. We've assigned the roles and responsibilities. It's all woven into an intricate, wonderful strategic plan. But now we have to question whether that destination, that new neighborhood, is still a good neighborhood because things have changed. And gosh, we live in a world now in which things change so quickly on every front, not just technology, but gosh, the socioeconomic environment, the competitive environment, right? It really, really changes fast. And so the judgment to say we need to throw it all out and start over again, or we just need to make a tiny little adjustment, or really the answer is almost always somewhere in between, is a really important one. And the more that organizations are in strategic conversations and strategic dialogues, the better equipped they are to not only not get disrupted by this, but to embrace it and say, you know what? That's life, as the old song says, right? Put Frank Sinatra on in the background. Say the only thing you can reliably expect out of life is change. And if you've got a strategic mindset, you're always a little bit more postured to embrace that and deal with it, even if it requires some wrenching change.
Well, let me shift gears a little bit. I'm going to throw out the tripwire question. So I believe it was Peter Drucker that famously said, "Culture will eat strategy for breakfast." What's your take on the relationship with the company culture and the strategy they're trying to execute?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great quip, and I think you're always on perilous ground to try to take on anything Peter Drucker ever said or wrote, because he's a bit of the oracle. I was on a search committee for a college president. I was a trustee of a college, and he was a management professor. So during the interview, I asked him, I said, "Who's your favorite management thinker?" And when he said Peter Drucker, I said, "Oh yeah, this guy's going to be good for the job. He's on the right track." Right. So at my peril. However, I think we can be tempted. I think Drucker would admit as much as anybody that life's complex. And you never want to reduce the complexities of life, especially organizational life, which is we're talking about here today, to a fortune cookie expression or some kind of universalism answer, some kind of universalist answer. So culture is really important. I have a big piece in the section about what is strategy and how does it fit with about values. And values really are culture, systems of belief, patterns of behavior, that kind of thing. And they're really, really important, and they have to inform a strategy. So I'll give you an example. I'm working with a big public company, kind of a button-down management consulting type firm. And they said they want to be more of a technical solutions provider. And they want to make stuff, not just advise on stuff. They want to make solutions, not just advise on, perhaps help them implement solutions. And I said, well, culturally, I said, what's your tolerance for failure? They said, "Oh, not good. No, we don't tolerate failure very well around here, right? Everybody shows up on time, wearing the right thing, doing the right thing. Everybody always needs to get on board with the plan. We're a lockdown kind of organization. I said, well, if you're going to get into the technology solutions business, you're going to fail a lot. And you need to embrace it. You need to fail fast forward, as they say. You need to have all these things. So I outlined all these values, all these cultural qualities that they would need to implement the new strategy. I think this proves Drucker's point. They could have done M&A, and they did. They could have done all these other things to get technology solutions capabilities. But if they didn't evolve the culture of the firm to support the values that technology solutions oriented enterprises have, they were not going to be successful. So I take Drucker's point here on this, and I think it's really important. And my approach, having written a previous book almost entirely about leadership culture, is it's part of strategy. You need to weave it in because strategy is conducted by human beings. And human beings have values and systems of belief and patterns of behavior.
Yeah. Well, I like that. And what I've done with a lot of my clients, I've talked to them and convinced them that this thing we think about in culture is not so mysterious. It can be boiled down to simply the question, how are we going to do things?
Mm.
And you can do them quick and fast. You can accept risk. That's all part of that equation of defining how are you going to do your thing. And if you say it's got to be buttoned down, it's got to be perfect, it's got to be 100, it's got to be all these things. Well, a proposition that has high risk, a high probability of frequent fail, that's not going to work for you.
That's right. That's right. I like to tell her, how do you know culture when you see it? I like to say it's how people behave around here.
Yeah.
I think it's very similar. How do we do things around here,
Yeah.
right?
And that too, when you think of the creation of a culture from a bottom up, when two people start building a relationship, there is a culture that emerges.
Right. That's right. That's right.
And the dynamic of how they talk to each other and what they do and the jokes they tell and the stories they revel in, it's all a function of how that relationship matures, and that in and of itself represents a culture.
Right.
So, and you look at the history of man, you look at the way we cluster together in tribes or groups, or whether it's ethnically or socially or morally, we all may have our gatherings we go to on a regular basis because we identify with the beliefs and the principles espoused by that group. And we like participating in it and we want to be a part of it and maybe help carry it forward. But it's a multifaceted, multi-layered onion to be peeled for sure. And the CEO or chairman that says we're going to change our company culture, well, there might actually be a time and place to do that, but that is no small task.
No, it's no small task. I was thinking here about Netflix. I don't really talk about Netflix in the book, but they've had to reinvent themselves a couple of times. When they started, they were essentially a logistics company. And it was the key to their culture. It was the key to successful. They were sort of like Amazon, right? They were in a warehouse in Sacramento and they're overnighting DVDs to people. That was the essential activity they had to get right. Then they started to become more of a technology company, first with a internet access that included queues to recommend movies and all these other things, but also then piping streaming movies to people. So it had become a technology. Those are two totally different cultures, a logistics company and a technology company. And then the third phase is when it became so expensive to license other people's content, they started creating their own content, making their own movies. Now they're an entertainment company. Right. These you could not imagine, and having worked in and around all three industries and studied them, you could not imagine three more different kinds of culture than a technology company, an entertainment company, and a logistics company. And yet they had to pivot 3 times. So it can be done, but I would say it happens less often than more often successfully.
Well, John, as we get near the end of this episode, give us a wrap up here. If a leader is out there listening to this and they feel a little bit lacking in their ability to understand or think strategically, where do they start? What's your advice?
Well, they grabbed my book, The Strategy Dialogues, because, and I'm not kidding. When you see the preface, you could have written the preface right there, Doug. It was written for those people, right? You're going to be judged in your whole executive lifetime on your ability to think and act strategically. What does that mean? Maybe it's unfair. You're going to be judged on this when you're not being trained in it. But here's a resource. And I not only have the greatest hits of strategic thinking, as I mentioned, I map out the process people use to solve strategy problems very simply. And at the end of every chapter, I have a whiteboard summary and a kind of, annotated bibliography of where all the sources are to go get more information. So, one of the themes of the book is I've read all the strategy books. You don't have to, right? I kind of put it in one place. But here's what I would leave your listeners with is there's a temptation, and I hear about it a lot, to put off thinking strategically or doing strategy in your organization. The temptation comes not only from being 24/7 on task accomplishment, which we talked about. So I often hear, I'm just too busy. I'm too busy for that big thinking strategy stuff. But the other temptations that people come to is I hear executives in smaller companies say, that's a big company drill. IBM can afford to do that. I'm working down here, right? I'm spending the morning with our most important client and I'm fixing the office coffee machine in the afternoon, right? I don't have time for strategy. Big companies need that. Little companies don't. So I would say to them, okay, well, if you just want to blunder into the future, letting it happen, you like the weather and you don't want to plan for it. You don't want to try to confront it. You don't want to try to understand it. You don't want to position yourself for advantage in it. Go right ahead. And they say, no, of course I want to do all that stuff. I'll say, okay, then you can think strategically. It's not going to take up a lot of your time. Another temptation that executives will give over to that I sometimes hear as an objection is to think of this as too theoretical. So that was one of the things I tried to do in the book is bring it out of the clouds and put it down into your hands. Here's some tools. Go to work, and I'll even show you which tools to use for which kind of jobs around the house. But there's tools. You can go to work. It's a disciplined thought process intended to help you deal with the ambiguity of a rapidly changing future out ahead of you. So leaders should not think of strategy as a distraction from their work or a luxury they only do at the offsite. They need to think of it as the heart of their responsibilities. Because if it's not you doing it as the leader, whether you're leading a 3-person team or a 300,000 person corporation, who else is going to do it? Who else is going to say, I'm going to help us design a path to a better future? Okay. It's a leadership responsibility. So that's why I tell leaders, embrace it and get good at it, and you'll actually have fun with it.
Yeah. I think those are great words of wisdom there. And for all of you listening that maybe have struggled with this challenge in your career development and career trajectory, grab John's book. It's a great read. John, one more time, the title of the book for everybody.
Yeah, the Strategy Dialogues. And you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you get books in all formats. Actually, the audio edition comes out next month, and which it'll be late April 2025. And I've got a bunch more information about the work I've done and some of the things I do on johnhillen.com.
Very good. Very good. Well, as always, folks, we're going to have that information in our show notes. So when you get to a safe place and look at those notes, please do hop down and mash any of the links that are in there, and you'll be able to get in touch with John. So one last time, John, thanks so much for sitting in.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for what you're doing.
You bet. And I do like to remind you folks that we do have a video version of this show over on YouTube, a channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Go over there, check out the archives, and give us some feedback. Leave us some comments about things you'd like to hear if you haven't already heard something in one of our episodes, or if you've got a recommendation for another guest that you'd like to hear from. Please drop me a line. Let me know that. You can reach out to me at my website, Doug Thorpe, THORPE.com. There's a lot of information there, free downloads, some blog articles, and the links to all these episodes. So feel free to hop over there as well. But I think we're about done with our agenda for today. So we're going to sign off, say goodbye. Go out there and make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.